Muhami Matters with Chris Adams, powered by CJA Consulting.
Welcome to Muhami Matters, where credibility meets clarity in legal and professional services. I'm your host, Chris Adams, founder of Muhami and CJA Consulting. In today's episode, we're tackling a topic that is both timely and essential: how businesses communicate in challenging times. When markets are a bit unsettled, when clients are cautious, teams are anxious, and events outside our control begin to affect decision-making, communication becomes far more than a marketing function. It becomes a leadership responsibility. To help us unpack that today, I'm joined by the very, very well-known Ananda Shakespeare, founder of Shakespeare Communications. Ananda's got decades of experience spanning journalism, PR, and strategic communications in both the UK and the UAE. Ananda's worked closely with businesses navigating uncertainty, reputational risk, and changing stakeholder expectations. Today, we're going to be discussing crisis communications, both internal and external messaging, leadership tone, the importance of empathy, and why the toughest times often reveal the true strength of a business. Ananda, welcome. Thank you for joining us here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Chris. I'm looking forward to today's session. It's very in-depth. Let's see how much we get through.
I think we'll get through a lot. Ananda, for those who don't really know you, could you just briefly introduce yourself and your business?
Yeah, indeed. I thought you made a very good introduction already. Ananda Shakespeare, founder and CEO of Shakespeare Communications, which is a Dubai-based PR strategic comms consultancy. I have more than 30 years media experience across journalism, editorial, PR, strategic comms. And we work with earned messaging and thought leadership, social media a little bit, content, events, and we support sort of broader reputation building too. And we've got experience across UK and UAE markets, so we understand different perspectives and cultures, and very well versed in handling pressure. Half the team used to work in fast-paced newsrooms. So yeah, I think that's a in-depth enough intro.
Oh, that's great. So you started as a journalist. So many journalists I know end up in PR and communications. Tell us a little bit about what led you to make the switch.
Okay. I never thought I'd leave London, UK, and here I am in the UAE of 21 years. Again, I didn't think I'd ever leave journalism. I was in journalism for probably 15 years in both London and Dubai. And I took a year sabbatical out, thought I would be coming back to journalism. I got headhunted for sort of head of content for an IT and telecoms firm, rolling out a new intranet and chatbots for the first time for them. And after a couple of years there, I started Shakespeare Communications, and that was just before the pandemic. And so, yeah, that's what got me started on that path.
So it's almost going to the other side, I guess. You're not the dark side, but it's almost going to the other side. A little bit like, well, the lawyers I work with talk about going from in-house to private practice and vice versa. But it does allow you to see both sides of the coin, I guess, and both perspectives. So how is having that journalistic experience shaped the way you advise clients during periods of uncertainty from a communications point of view?
Yeah, it teaches you what really matters for sure. And that credibility is hard won, but easily lost. You have to really look at all stakeholders, whether that's the clients, employees, media, whatever stakeholders you have, and think about what your audience wants to hear at that time. So your tone is really important, as important as the content. And just remember to keep people informed and reassured, respected, not to ignore people. Silence can be quite damaging as well during uncertain periods, I would say.
So yeah, you alluded to uncertain periods. There has been some uncertainty over the last 6 to 8 weeks in the UAE and across the Middle East with geopolitical tensions. From what you're seeing on the ground, how are businesses in the UAE and the wider region responding to the current climate?
Yeah, I think many are being cautious and measured in their messaging. And there's definitely a greater sensitivity to tone, particularly around geopolitics, economic uncertainty, and public sentiment as well. So some businesses are communicating in the practical, calm and relevant tone, and others are using silence or defaulting to generic sort of corporate messaging. So there's definitely a mixed response. And of course, the stronger businesses are asking, what do their people or stakeholders need to hear from us at this time, rather than what do we want to say? So that's quite important. And in terms of, our client portfolio, we've got a real mix, some that are pausing PR altogether, and others that are sort of digging in and planning for the bright future, which, with much confidence in the UAE, which they should have.
Yeah, I definitely think communications for me is vital at times like these. What are the common mistakes or common communication mistakes you see leaders make?
I would say going quiet for too long, maybe over
Mm-hmm.
reassuring before they know the facts, perhaps treating communication as a one-off statement instead of an ongoing process, maybe sounding too polished or too commercial, because we need to be really human at this time, and also forgetting internal audiences and sometimes focusing too much on external reputation. I think those would be the main thoughts.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it can be quite reputationally damaging, both internally and externally. And I've seen at times like these, when crises come or challenging times, communications often one of the first things that come under pressure. Why is that? Why do communications often one of the first things that come under pressure when arguably it matters most?
Well, I think because leaders often focus on operations first instead of perhaps communications, and communications can often be treated as secondary importance after operations. Some leaders are worried about saying the right thing, so it can come down to something like that, and which is often can lead to people being silent, saying nothing. But yeah, if anything, uncertainty increases the need for clarity, I would say.
Yeah, so when a business is navigating this uncertainty, where should leaders focus first then? You mentioned that internal communications often gets put to the side. Is that where they should start?
Yes, you do need to start with internal, but I mean that's the pressure, isn't it? You need to be doing both. So yeah, it's not easy, but your employees are your most credible ambassadors, so you do need to brief them first. If they're confused, then external messaging maybe can start feeling a bit hollow. So everything needs to be aligned in terms of messaging, and even if the words differ between audiences, you don't want your employees and stakeholders hearing things necessarily from external sources, so the news. Yeah, I think I get that covers it. So it's not easy to communicate fast under pressure, but it is necessary.
How do leaders manage it then when you've got internal communications to worry about? You've got the external communications, which arguably, as you alluded to, could be influenced by the internal communications or lack thereof. The internal staff don't understand what message they should be saying, what they're telling their families and their friends. Arguably, they say the wrong thing. How do you balance that push of internal, external communications and perhaps trying to do both at once?
Yeah, you've got to be pragmatic, and you've got to have regular communication. So you don't want drama, you want clarity. You need to be practical, explain to people what's going on, what's going to happen next, where to go with questions if questions arise later. Make sure there's space for two-way communication as well, not just top-down communication. And also remember that everyone's under their own personal pressures too, and those can be different. They can be financial, emotional. So there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, I guess the antithesis of uncertainty is certainty. So I'd imagine that's what you want to give people. You don't really want your internal stakeholders being uncertain and worried and uncomfortable. You want them to be able to focus on their job and feel comfortable. So what what's the best practice, I guess, for good internal communication when staff are a bit anxious or distracted or, perhaps worried about their personal circumstances?
Yeah. I mean, honesty is the best policy, isn't it? Be honest about what you can say, what you don't know yet, when the next update will be. And, confidence doesn't mean pretending, that things are certain when they're not. You've got to be calm, you've got to be respectful, and avoid that false positivity. I mean, both your people and the media will appreciate honesty. So it's really okay to say, we're working through this at the moment. We will give you more updates on Friday or whatever it is, whenever it is. So it's just that reassurance on honesty.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing from you, I guess, is the reassurance and giving as much certainty as you can without lying or without, telling white lies, or because you might not always have the right answer as a leader. So my question was going to be, how do you strike the right tone as a leader with your team? But honesty sounds like the right tone to have.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be really adult to adult. There's no point saying there's nothing to worry about when there is. Try not to be vague, evasive. Try not to have mixed messages coming from different leadership teams. Or, again, you've got to be careful on the tone, not coming across with too much legal language or minimizing your employees' concerns, things like that.
What else should you avoid saying?
Yeah. Try not to be too sanitized with your messaging. And yeah, I think I've covered most of that.
I guess that's what I would see as a challenge, is really balancing transparency without causing unnecessary concern.
Exactly. Yeah. Communication is tricky, and that's why practice it makes perfect, and that's why teams and leadership, and not just leadership, but operations and all sorts of different people within organizations should have media training and simulation for crises and stuff like that. Because when something happens, then you're drawing on some experience. It's the same as, practicing your first aid or anything else like that. You've got to keep trying those skills so that they're not rusty when you need them, when you need to draw on them.
Practice makes perfect. Have you have any examples of what you've seen over your 30 plus years career where you've seen poor internal communication, especially during crises?
I mean, public crises would be things like airlines. Remember there was that airline in America who lost some guy's guitar, and then he wrote a song about it because they didn't lose it. I think they damaged it, and he made his income from it. So that's a well-known crisis situation.
Well, let's look at the external bit then. In difficult periods, what should a leader of a business or a spokesperson be thinking about messaging when talking to external stakeholders, to the media? What are the main considerations?
So it depends on the situation. But for example, if it was a crisis, then you need to lead with empathy. So, for example, another airline or aviation example would be, a plane going missing and people not knowing where their loved ones are, where the plane is. And so empathy is really important in crisis situations. So you have to start with whatever those audience concerns are. Might not be a crisis to that level, not sort of spouting company talking points, focusing on what matters: continuity, support, responsiveness, practical steps. And you should have all of this in the back. You should know what steps to do when. You should have something clearly written down to help you know how to prioritize as well. So keep messaging simple. You want messages to be consistent and easily repeatable. So sometimes it's saying the same message over and over again. Like, good example of that is, of course, COVID. So there was lots of messaging around COVID for safety. So you want to avoid jargon. The language you use has got to be appropriate for the audience. And it's not a time for for self-promotion of a brand. I think brands and people, individuals and brands, were all judged on the worst times and how we lead through a crisis. So you can actually come out much stronger.
So how do you strike that balance then? If it's, things are a bit rough for the company, if a plane went missing, for example, and you're an airline, how do you not sound tone deaf or overly commercial?
Well, you need to lead with relevance and usefulness. So people want helpful information.
Mm-hmm.
Who was on the plane? What time did it leave? When was it last spotted electronically where on route? Is what you're saying helping your audience? You don't want silence, particularly in an age of social media, because what happens if a plane goes down or goes missing or there's some sort of crisis is everybody's talking about it on social media. So this is why you have to have steps in place before something happens and react really quickly. So you need to be rolling out things very quickly and not ignoring social media, for example. Yeah, there's a lot to think about, and that's why planning is really key for scenarios that you think could happen. I mean, you can't plan for the unplanned, the unknown.
Complete unknown, yeah, absolutely. Which is probably a situation where a lot of us have been in recently. So you've spoken about the importance of reassurance, empathy, and compassion. Again, thinking about examples, where have you seen this done poorly, and where have you seen it done well of your career?
I mean, some brands that are great at communication are Emirates. They've done really well recently. Anybody that's been traveling and flying from the region with them, they've been the easiest airline to communicate with, to reschedule flights and know what's going on. I can't think of any specific negative examples, but,
Well, people say there's no such thing as bad publicity. Is that true?
well, I always I tend to more agree with that. Because I'm quite old school, been in communications for a long time. But, your clients may not always hold the same perspective. Because you change a crisis, turn something bad into something good. If you apologize for something that's gone wrong, even if you've ordered something from your favorite brand and it's been delayed, it hasn't turned up, and you get on the phone or the chats and you're a bit irate and where's my package? Well, actually, that retailer could say to you, well, we did send it on this date. We're really sorry that you haven't received it. We'll check with the third party on where that order is. In the meantime, we'd like to refund the money to you. And if it turns up, let us know, but we will send another one in replacement. Something like that is so incredible that you'll become so loyal to that brand afterwards. So there's lots that you can do to turn a bad situation good, I would say.
Where do you draw the line, though? If you know that, I mean, there is that old saying, again, the old school saying that the customer is always right. But if you, as an organization, know you're in the right, you haven't done anything wrong, and you know this is a customer that's, probably trying to get a bit of publicity or trying to, I guess, prove a point, have some vindictiveness or something like that. How do you manage that from a PR perspective?
You've got to be diplomatic. But sometimes brands use humour as well. So I always listen and try and be understanding and try and be empathetic and thank you for your feedback. We appreciate your feedback, But it depends what it is. Sometimes with sort of food brands, you might get comedians sending letters saying, "Oh, I didn't receive my chocolate bar, my order of chocolate bars. They didn't turn out." That brand could be in on the joke and send a response back and in the same comedic tone, So it depends what it is and how serious it is. to how you can communicate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess in a time of crisis as well, when a company's facing a big challenge, who should you roll out? Who should be the one who goes and speaks to the media? Who should be the one that talks to the stakeholders generally?
Well, each company will have its, or organization will have its protocol for that. So for most companies, it's the CEO. If the communication is about something technical, they might have a technical expert, which is why media training is really important. It's not just for the CEO, it's often for heads of departments as well. So it really depends. But that clarity should generally be there before a media request comes in, and you should have the spokesperson bios and pictures all ready to go and up to date, and be clear on that and have all your media training done. And we offer media training if anyone needs it.
Well, that sounds like a good offer, I think. I was just thinking in terms of what you mentioned. I feel like that applies a lot to corporations and larger businesses. But if you're a small, medium business, with up to, say, 100 employees, you might not have the resources to have a dedicated communications team, or, a dedicated spokesperson, or even the resources to do all the preparation. How should those sort of businesses preempt what might happen and be prepared?
Yeah. So it should be the CEO. It should be the person at the top in a small organization. And they should be confident and definitely respond to media inquiries where they can. It's great, brand profiling, raising for them if they feel confident to do that. And it's, you can build your own media relations. So if that journalist reaches out to you and asks for comment, and you respond quickly and you're helpful and you're polite, then that journalist will come back to you again. So it's quite rewarding and fun to be able to do your own media relations too, if you don't have a budget to get someone to help you.
Yeah, I can imagine it must be quite intimidating for some people. I know a lot of leaders or people who have founded organizations are quite technical in what they do. They're very good at what they do as a service or as a specialism, but perhaps that doesn't always equate to media relation skills or even human relation skills, interpersonal skills. So what kind of advice would you give to them in a crisis, or if something's gone a little bit awry and it's come out in the public?
It's better not to go silent. It's better to hold your hand up and say, we're sorry, something went wrong and this is why, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Particularly perhaps with finance spokespeople, sometimes, perhaps engineers and finance people, those sorts of people, they might be very technically good at their job, but they might not be so great on soft skills. So they want to be avoiding jargon, 3-letter acronyms, that sort of stuff. Also, journalists aren't necessarily experts in your industry. So as well as, you've got to think about your audience, who you're speaking to, and make sure you're speaking in an appropriate way. So if there's a crisis, it's not really about promoting yourself. You're there to, offer comments and be helpful rather than, really build your profile.
You make an interesting point there about journalists not being experts. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a journalist, and I always thought that looks like a great job, but it also looks quite tough because you see journalists, covering multiple stories per day in different industries, in different topics. How do you, as a communications professional, assist journalists and the media who may not be, specialists in that field, to report the story in the way that you want it to be reported, not in a truthful way? How do you help them to steer them in the right direction and, I guess, influence them in a positive way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, some journalists are, so you often can tell by the job title. Are they the finance reporter from Bloomberg or something like that? Or if they're from Financial Times Middle East, then they've got a financial expertise. But there are many journalists out there who work across industries like I have done. I haven't been particularly specialist through my career, and then we've got my sister who was a fashion journalist, very niche. So You want to give a journalist as much background as possible before an interview, for example. So if there's going to be an interview, you'll send the bio for the person, that spokesperson. You'll send the about us, the company information. You'll send a clear headshot in color and high resolution if it's for a print. Sometimes journalists won't share specific questions ahead. They might only share topics. So you need to ask the journalist if they will share questions. If they won't, then you need to push for topics. So you don't want to agree to an interview unless you know at least what the topic's about so that you can prepare for it yourself. Most media outlets won't give you what we call like copy approval. So they won't necessarily show you the interview before it goes live. You can always ask, but understand that most will say no. And I think that's the most that you can do. And you mean the journalists will ask if they don't understand something, so you can clarify. And feel confident at the end of an interview. They'll normally ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add? So it's a good perhaps opportunity to add any key messages you've left not mentioned, which if they're relevant. But interviews, particularly if they're sort of live, if on radio or TV, they can be over very quickly. So it's trying to get the win-win, because a journalist will want to discuss something with you. Perhaps there's a news hook, perhaps there's new regulation that's come out, and they'll want your expertise on that, from you've got an industry perspective. And so you're there to answer questions about that new regulation, how it impacts your industry, perhaps. So it's not necessarily the time to start being too self-promotional about your brand and what you do. So just be mindful. You want to get the best out of it, but you've also got to deliver whatever the journalist needs. And if you don't have facts and figures, it's very good to go into an interview with some stats and data. Journalists tend to love those. If you don't know something, you can say, well, you've got to have segue phrases. So, well, I don't have the reports on Q1 yet, but we do know that January and February was very good. What we can tell you is, so you have a segue phrase. So talk about what you know. Don't be caught off guard. If you're getting asked something you don't know, just pivot to something you do.
You really got to think on the hop, don't you? Okay, so when times are a bit tough, when things are, not going so well, whether it's a reputational risk or there's just uncertainty in general. You mentioned you don't want to be tone deaf. You want to be empathetic. Is it the right time to communicate now with thought leadership and that sort of thing? And if so, what kind of content or commentary tends to land well?
Yeah. If it's got to be genuinely useful. So if it ticks that box, then go ahead. It can be a really good time to share expertise, whether it's Q&A, comment piece, explainer, op-ed, opinion editorial, we call them, practical checklists. But we have to remember again, what lands well is honesty as well as experience. So we don't want anything too generic. We want perhaps specific insights into something that's going on at the time. I guess again, the pandemic is a good example of that those sorts of times are quite testing, but they can be quite good for a brand and put you in a really good light, depending on how you communicate.
So I think it sounds really like challenging times act as a kind of a litmus test for leadership and business culture, internally, externally. There's so many factors to consider. What have you observed generally about the businesses that communicate well under pressure versus those that struggle?
They remember you. You become top of mind because they remember how you behaved under strain, and it really, reveals the culture of an organization. People are still, we're in 26. People are still talking about how the UAE was so fantastic. The UAE government was so fantastic during the COVID pandemic, which was 2020, 6 years ago. People are still talking about it now. So that's the power of reputation building during a crisis, and how you communicate, if you communicate well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because the COVID crisis, I guess, was not to be predicted. Nobody knew it was going to happen. So what did, say, the UAE government do well? How did they react so quickly and react so well? They must have had some preparation in place, but how did they just react? I remember they locked us all down, for example, and told us all very clearly, you're not allowed to leave the house. You need to apply on the police website to go to the shops, for example. But we didn't panic. It was just kind of well communicated, well understood.
Yeah, I believe they have a crisis committee, so everything is planned and prepared. And that's why we're still talking about it now. Things were rolled out quickly because all those scenario work had been done already, and all those things were in place to roll out. So yeah, I mean, it was absolutely wonderful. The weaker stakeholders have confused messaging, perhaps trying to control situations too much or things like that. So, I mean, the other thing is with the recent events in the GCC region, again, it's put the UAE, for example, and other nations in a really good spotlight. The great levels of diplomacy, the great messaging and communication, lots of communication done on a daily basis to the public via the media. It's not necessarily about having perfect communication. It's about communicating. So things don't always have to be perfect, but you need to be able to have a conversation and be honest. And I think the general public have really appreciated that at this time. So yeah, it's put the country in really good standing again. And there's a great campaign at the moment, which is proud of UAE. So lots of people have got those on their phone and they're putting it over LinkedIn, and we're seeing campaigns around the city, lots of flags up. So it's a really patriotic time.
Yes. Yeah, and I feel like, there's been times where parts of the Middle East have been accused of not communicating very well, of being, not very transparent. But I do feel on this occasion like there was a lot of transparency from the UAE government.
Yeah.
And that, for me, built a lot of certainty and trust, and, you felt safe. You felt like you were actually being told what was happening without being over communicative. There was only certain government ministers that were talking to the media, and they were very diplomatic and they were very clear in what they were saying. The messaging was very clear, and there wasn't confusion. There was quite a lot of certainty. So
yeah, and particularly with the
well done.
UAE, with a makeup of a 90% expatriate, a lot of us compare the leadership here to our home countries, and we know, the UAE has a smaller population, and so it is able to manage crises quite well, whereas perhaps our home countries wouldn't have that level of financial resources and so forth. So yeah, I think we all feel
probably not enough forethought. I feel like, most of our home countries wouldn't have reacted as well because they just weren't well prepared, which brings us to the point of pretty much what you've been saying all along is preparation. So, many businesses don't probably have a proper communications plan. Why is that such a gap?
Yeah, people bury their heads in the sand for sure. I mean, it's shocking how many private companies don't have a crisis plan or a crisis communication plan in hand, and even smaller companies should too. Because the thing is, it's very easy to push to the bottom of your to-do list because it's not urgent now. But when it becomes urgent, you wish you'd put the time and the spend into it. And I think a lot of companies underestimate how quickly reputational issues can escalate. So yeah, do the planning now before something goes wrong is my advice for sure.
So what should a solid crisis communication playbook actually include then?
You want clear sort of escalation protocols. Everybody needs to know what to do and when to do it. Clear roles and responsibilities, including sign off for things. Stakeholder mapping for employees, clients, media partners, regulators. Holding statements in place. Should have holding statements for different scenarios on file already, instead of having to bang it out at the last minute. And core messaging frameworks as well. Again, protocols around who the spokespeople are, who's guiding those spokesperson from a media perspective, internally or externally with your agencies, clear communication chains for approval. And definitely, there's lots of crisis communication simulation software out there. We've got third parties we work with where we can do that in English and even in Arabic. And I've done a lot of those simulation workshops myself over the years. They're quite fun to do. They really test you and they show you how good your communications are. I do that myself rigorously and regularly. So don't put it off. When your revenue's up in Q4, book in with us to do some crisis communication simulation workshops, and you won't regret it. And you should have a very clear crisis communication playbook as well. And depending on how large your company is and so forth, depends how big that is. The other thing is, really good companies update those regularly. They've got that. They don't just do it as a one-off crisis simulation 1 year and we'll get the playbook ready and that's it. And we sit back and do nothing for 5 years. You need to be regularly updating that, or all the contacts has so-and-so from the head of operations left. Is there someone else now? What's his WhatsApp? Have you got a WhatsApp group for emergencies set up already? Do you have, black and white graphics to change, if your company is an aviation company, can you take off all the smiling pictures of your chair people? Can you change to a website, a separate website, and swap that over quickly? And same on your social media. If there's been a death, you want black and white graphics, and you don't want anyone smiling, tone deaf. So there's a lot to consider, but all of this is about planning. You need to, if you've planned, then you can quickly roll out these things, and it's going to make you look much better to the public and to your stakeholders.
So who needs to be involved then in this preparation of the crisis communication playbook and the scenario planning? It sounds like a communications professional is a must, whether it's an internal resource or an external agency one. Who else needs to be involved in this?
Yeah, and sometimes both. I mean, it's essential. And, communications can't plan in isolation. We're all connected, like you said. So your human resources teams for internal comms, your legal counsel for sure, because your holding statement might need to go through legal. The thing about that is, legal will often give you very dry and not very empathetic text to use, and you might want to rewrite that so that it's still legal but communicates in a softer manner. So you need to be doing your crisis planning and knowing who you want involved and will need involved for sure. And it's across departments.
So assuming there is a business leader listening to us today and they haven't got any of this in place, what are the first practical steps they can take this week to start to strengthen their communication readiness?
Yeah, well, I would hope the CEOs know what their top 3 reputational operational risks are. If they don't, that's the first thing they need to do. Who would lead communications if something happened tomorrow? Create that basic holding statement we talked about. Review internal contact lists and approval processes. Clarify the spokesperson's responsibilities, perhaps. You've got to be careful. You don't shove a spokesperson on TV and they haven't had legal counsel already. So you've got to be careful what you're saying because you don't want to go back on promises. You want to align your internal and external comms for sure. But it's, as I said before, it's all about practice.
Practice makes perfect, and prior preparation prevents poor performance. I think I got that acronym PPPPP right. So looking just to sort of wind us up, because it's been really informative, a lot of practical tips. I want to talk about recovery, I guess. So when the pressure does begin to lift a little bit and you need to start recovering, how do businesses communicate that recovery, the resilience and the next steps and rebuild their reputation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be, I've been having this conversation with quite a lot of brands and companies at the moment, and even prospective clients. There needs to be a transition. So your messaging should have changed already, and you don't want to just stop one type of messaging and then go into another. There needs to be that transition period. So you want to be measured in your communication, you want to be credible, but you don't want to perhaps be triumphant. Depends what's going on. You want to thank your stakeholders, perhaps your clients, and other stakeholders where appropriate. You might need more communication about explaining what's coming next. So yeah, it's delicate. Communication can be delicate.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned humour is something that can be used. I guess it really is a delicate thing as well. It can be used very positively, but also could actually fall flat on its face.
That's right. It's very difficult. Humour is very difficult to use in communications, particularly within the UAE. And the reason being is that it's 90% expatriate. There's over 200 nationalities here. So that's one of the reasons you don't use a lot of humour in communications out here. But you do occasionally see it. I've had SMSs from IKEA about beds and funny things, but just sort of in an advertising sort of SMS. So it depends what it is. But when it comes to a crisis, you're probably not going to use humour for sure.
What are the underlying messages that need to come out as part of that recovery? Is it things like certainty and resilience still, or is it other things?
Yeah, certainty and resilience for sure. I mean, empathy is strategic. It's not just a soft skill. You know, you need to be consistent in your communications. Relevance, resilience, consistency, tone, all these things that we've talked about today are all important.
All right. Well, I've really appreciated everything you've told us about today, Ananda. If there's a few business people out there, leaders quaky in their boots thinking, okay, I'm not quite prepared, how would they get in touch with you to get prepared?
Yeah, they can find our website, shakespearecomms.com, or find me on LinkedIn, Ananda Shakespeare, and reach out to us via email or mobile. We're quite easy to find on a quick search online.
So you do practice what you preach. Your communications are good.
I hope so. Being a former journalist, we tend to respond within 24 hours in our team. That tends to be our service level agreement for our clients. And this is one reason we have such great media relations. So it's all very much business and communication. A lot of it's done on WhatsApp. So it is about responding very quickly and moving very fast.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ananda Shakespeare, for sharing such clear, practical insights on how businesses can communicate with credibility, empathy, and confidence when the pressure is on.
Thank you very much.
To our listeners, thank you also to you for joining us. In challenging times, I guess we found our communications not just about protecting reputation, it's about leading people, influencing people, strengthening trust, and making sure your business is prepared and readily equipped to respond with clarity rather than panic. So for me, if there's one takeaway from today, I guess to say is don't go quiet when things get tough. Be prepared to communicate with clarity, consistency, and empathy. I think Ananda's perspective is a timely reminder that those organisations that do communicate thoughtfully today are often the ones who are best placed to recover and grow tomorrow. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with your network. For more insights and support, visit muhami.ae, connect with me at CJA Consulting. I'm Chris Adams. Till next time, stay informed and stay empowered. Thank you for joining us on Muhami Matters. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe and connect with me to stay updated. Join me again soon as we continue to bring you credible insights, practical strategies, and trusted advice to empower your professional journey. I'm Chris Adams. Until next time, stay informed and stay empowered.